which was why we had sent our agent there. It was dangerous work for all of us, but especially for Agent Gautier. The area was dark, and there were no streetlights. The tall reeds along the river were thick and provided cover for pickups and liaisons, and kidnappings. Agent Peggy Katz and I were on the edge of the reeds, which resembled elephant grass. During the past half hour, she had admitted that she wasn't really interested in sports, but had learned about basketball and football because she wanted to be able to talk with her male counterparts about something. Men talk about other things, I said, as I scouted the fens through night glasses. I know that. I can talk about money and cars, too. But I refuse to talk to you horny bastards about sex. I coughed out a laugh. Katz could deliver her lines. She was often wry, with a twinkle, and she seemed to be laughing with you, even if you happened to be the butt of her jokes. But I also knew that she was very tough, a real hard-liner. "Why did you join the Bureau?" she asked, as we continued to wait for Agent Gautier to appear. "You were doing well with the Washington PD, right?" I was doing just fine. I lowered my voice and pointed toward a clearing up ahead. "Here comes Gautier now." Agent Gautier had just left Boylston Street. He was walking slowly across the fens toward the muddy river. I knew the area pretty well from an earlier scouting trip. During the day, this same section of the park was called the Victory Gardens. Area residents raised flowers and vegetables, and there were signs pleading with night visitors not to trample them. The team leader, Roger Nielsen, spoke in a whisper that seeped into my earphones. "Male in the watch cap, Alex. Stout guy. You see him?" "I've got him." Watchcap was talking into a microphone on the collar of his sports shirt. He wasn't one of ours, so he must have been one of theirs. The Wolves. I began to scour the area for a partner or two. The kidnapping crew? Probably. Who the hell else could they be? Nielsen said, "I think he has a mic on. You see it?" "He's definitely mic'd." "I see another suspicious male. Near the gardens to the left of us," I said. "Talking into his collar, too. They're moving on Gautier." Chapter 86. There were 3 of them, bulky males, and they began to converge on Paul Gautier. At the same time, we moved on them. I had my Glock out, but was I really ready for what might happen in this small, dark park? The kidnappers were keeping close to Park Drive, and I figured they had a van or truck out on the street. They looked confident and unafraid. They'd done this before, grabbed purchased men and women. They were professional kidnappers. "Take them now," I told Senior Agent Nielsen. "Gautier's at risk." "Wait until they grab him," the response came back. "We want to do this right. Wait." I didn't agree with Nielsen, and I didn't like what was happening. Why wait? Gautier was hanging out there too much, and the park was dark. "Gautier is at risk," I repeated. One of the men, blond, wearing a Boston Bruins windbreaker, waved to him. Gautier watched the man approach, nodded his head, smiled. The blonde had some kind of small flashlight in his hand. He lit up Paul Gautier's face. I could hear them talking. "Nice night for a walk," Gautier said, then laughed. He sounded nervous.
"The things we do for love,"
the blonde said. He spoke with a Russian accent. The 2 of them were only a few feet apart. The other abductors held back, but not far. Then the blonde whipped a gun out of his jacket pocket. He pushed it against Gautier's face.
"You're coming with me. No one will hurt you. Just walk with me. Make it easy on yourself."
The 2 others joined them. "You're making a mistake," said Gautier.
"Oh? And why is that?"
asked the blonde.
"I've got the gun, not you."
"Take them, now," came the order from Senior Agent Nielsen. "FBI, hands up, back away from him," Nielsen shouted as we ran forward. "FBI," came a second shout. "Everybody, hands up." Then everything went crazy. The other 2 abductors pulled out guns. The blonde still held his to Agent Gautier's skull.
"Back off,"
he screamed.
"I'll shoot him dead. Drop your guns." I shoot him. I promise you. I don't bluff.
Our agents continued to move forward, slowly. Then the worst thing happened. The heavy-set blonde shot Agent Paul Gaultier in the face. Chapter 87. Before the shock of the gun blast had faded, the three men took off running, very fast. Two of them galloped toward Park Drive, but the blonde who'd shot Paul Gaultier sprinted out onto Boylston Street. He was a big man, but he was motoring. I remembered hearing from Monty Donnelly that great Russian athletes, even former Olympians, were sometimes recruited into the mafia. Was Blondie a former jock? He moved like it. The confrontation, the shooting, and everything else reminded me of how little we knew about the Russian mobsters. How did they work? How did they think? I took off after him, an overload of adrenaline rocketing through my body. I still couldn't believe what had happened. It could have been avoided. Now Gaultier was possibly dead. Probably dead. I ran as I shouted, "Take them alive!" It should have been obvious, but the other agents had just seen Paul Gaultier gunned down. I didn't know how much street action or combat any of them had seen before, and we desperately needed to question the kidnappers once we caught them. I was getting winded. Maybe I needed more time in the physical training classes at Quantico. Or maybe it was because I'd spent too much time sitting around inside the Hoover building these past few weeks. I chased the blonde killer through a tree-lined residential area. A moment later, the trees cleared and the glittering towers of the Prudential Center and the Hancock loomed ahead. I glanced back. Three agents trailed behind, including Peggy Katz, who had her gun out. The man running ahead of me was approaching the Heinz Convention Center with 4 FBI agents racing behind. I was closing on him, but not enough. I wondered if maybe we'd gotten lucky. Could this be the wolf up ahead? He was hands-on, right? If it was, then we had him for murder. Whoever he was still moving well. A long-distance sprinter. "Stop! We'll shoot!" one of the agents yelled behind me. The blonde Russian didn't stop. He made a sharp sliding turn down a side street. It was narrow and darker than Boylston. One way. I wondered if he'd thought about his escape route before this. Probably not. The extraordinary thing was that he hadn't hesitated when he shot Agent Gaultier. "I don't bluff," he'd said. Who would murder so casually, with so many FBI watching? The wolf? He was supposed to be fearless and ruthless, maybe even crazy. One of his lieutenants? How did the Russians think? I could hear his shoes slapping hard on the pavement up ahead. I was gaining on the Russian a little, getting a second wind. Suddenly, he whirled around and fired at me. I threw myself down on the ground fast, but then I was up just as quickly, chasing after him again. I'd seen his face clearly. Broad, flat features, dark eyes, late 30s to early 40s. He turned again, planted, fired. I ducked behind a parked car. Then I heard a scream. I whirled around and saw an agent down. One of the men. Doyle Rogers. The blonde turned and started to run again. But I had my second wind and I thought I could catch him. Then what? He was ready to die. A shot rang out behind me. I couldn't believe what I saw. The blonde dropped, falling flat on his chest and face. He never moved once he hit the ground. One of the agents behind me had shot him. I turned and saw Peggy Katz. She was still in a shooting crouch. I checked on Agent Rogers and found he'd only been hit in the shoulder. He'd be okay. Then I walked back alone toward the fens. When I got there, I discovered that Paul Gaultier was still alive, but the 2 other kidnappers had gotten away. They'd commandeered a car on Park Drive, and our agents had lost them. Bad news. The worst. The whole operation had blown up in our faces. Chapter 88. I don't think I'd felt this bad about an operation in all my years with the Washington PD. Maybe in all my years combined. If I hadn't been sure before, I was now. I'd made a mistake in coming over to the FBI. They did things very differently from anything I was used to. They were by the book, by the numbers, and then suddenly they weren't. They had tremendous resources and staggering amounts of information, but they were often amateurs on the street. There was some great personnel and some incredible losers. After the shootout in Boston, I drove over to the FBI offices. The agents gathered there all looked shell-shocked. I couldn't blame them. What a mess. One of the worst I'd seen. I couldn't help feeling that Senior Agent Nielsen was the one responsible. But what did it matter? What good to cast around blame? 2 well-intentioned agents had been wounded. One had almost died. Maybe I shouldn't have, but I felt partly responsible. I'd told the senior agent to move in on Paul Gaultier faster, but he hadn't listened. The blond man I'd chased down Boylston Street had unfortunately died. Katz's bullet had hit him in the back of the neck and taken out most of his throat. He'd probably died instantly. He carried no identification. His wallet held a little more than $600, but not much else. He had tattoos of a snake, a dragon, and a black bear on his back and shoulders. Cyrillic lettering that no one had deciphered yet. Prison tats. We assumed he was Russian, but we had no name, no identification, no real proof. Photographs of the dead man and fingerprints had been taken, then sent to Washington. They were checking, so we had little to do in Boston until they called back. A few hours later, the Ford Explorer commandeered by the 2 other abductors was found in the parking lot of a convenience store in Arlington, Massachusetts. They had stolen a second vehicle out of the lot. By now, they'd probably switched it for yet another stolen car. A total screw-up in every way. Couldn't have gone worse. I was sitting in a conference room by myself, my face in my hands, when one of the Boston agents walked in. He pointed an accusatory finger my way. Director Burns's office on the line. Burns wanted me back in Washington. As simple and direct as that. There were no explanations or even recriminations about what had happened in Boston. I guess I was to be kept in the dark a little while longer about what he really thought, what the Bureau thought, and I just couldn't respect that way of operating. I got to the SIOC offices in the Hoover Building at 6 in the morning. I hadn't slept. The place was humming with activity, and I was glad no one had time to talk about the shooting of the 2 agents in Boston. Stacy Pollock came up to me a few minutes after I arrived. She looked as tired as I felt, but she put a hand on my shoulder. Everybody here knows that you felt Gaultier was in danger and tried to move in on the shooter earlier. I talked to Nielsen. He said it was his decision. I nodded, but then I said, maybe you should have talked to me first. Pollock's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing more about Boston. She finally spoke again. There's something else. We've had some luck. Most of us have been here all night. The money transfer we made to the Wolf's Den, she said. We used a contact of ours in the financial world, a banker from Morgan Chase's International Correspondent Unit. We were able to trace the money out of the Caymans. Then we monitored virtually every transaction to U.S. banks with correspondent relationships. Had them screen all inbound wire payment orders. That's where our consultant, Robert Hatfield, said it got tricky. The transaction zipped from bank to bank. New York, then Boston, Detroit, Toronto, Chicago, a couple of others. But we know where the money finally wound up. Where, I asked. Dallas. The money went to Dallas. And we have a name, a recipient for the funds. We're hoping that he's the Wolf. At any rate, we know where he lives, Alex. You're going to Dallas. Chapter 89. The earliest abduction cases we tracked had occurred in Texas, and dozens of agents and analysts went to work investigating them in depth. Everything about the case was in larger scale now. The surveillance details on the suspect's house and place of business were the most impressive I had ever seen. I doubted that any police force in the country, with the possible exceptions of New York and Los Angeles, could afford this kind of effort. As usual, the Bureau had done a thorough job of finding out everything possible about